The night everything collapsed, he stood in the rain, feeling the world he built crumble beneath his feet. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if losing everything might reveal who he truly was. The city lights blurred through the storm as his thoughts spiraled, each breath tighter than the last, like he was trapped inside a life he no longer recognized. People rushed past him without knowing they were brushing shoulders with a man who once commanded entire boardrooms, but now couldn't command his own heartbeat. He felt the weight of invisible failures pressing against his chest as he questioned what love ever meant when success was gone. When the wind grew too cold for pride, he stepped into a tiny diner, glowing like a worn-out lighthouse for the lost. He didn't expect anyone to notice him, but then a waitress looked up with the kind of gentle concern that cuts deeper than judgment. And just as he opened his mouth to ask for water, something in her eyes made him freeze because it felt like she already knew he was breaking. He sat at the counter, trying to steady his breath, feeling the strange discomfort of being seen in a moment he wished he could hide. The warmth of the diner wrapped around him like a blanket someone else had placed on his shoulders. An unfamiliar kind of gentleness after years of noise, pressure, and pride. He watched the waitress move with quiet purpose, and for a moment he wondered what it felt like to live a life built on more than ambition. He didn't know why her simple kindness rattled him, only that it made the ache inside him rise like a tide he could no longer ignore. As she set a napkin beside him, he heard himself whisper a thank you that sounded foreign on his own tongue, like it belonged to another man he hadn't met yet. For the first time that night, the storm outside seemed quieter than the one inside him. He stared at the water glass she'd given him, seeing the ripples tremble from his unsteady hands. He wondered how a man who once controlled empires could no longer control a single breath. Every sound in the diner felt louder, every small detail sharper, like life was forcing him to notice what he had spent years ignoring. When she asked if he wanted anything else, her voice was gentle enough to shake him, reminding him of a world where people cared without expecting something in return. It was both comforting and terrifying. He forced a small nod, afraid his voice might crack if he tried anything more. She didn't push, didn't pry, didn't ask why a man in a ruined suit with haunted eyes had walked into her diner at mid. Instead, she moved with a calmness that steadied the air between them. He watched her refill sugar jars, straighten menus, and wipe down counters with the quiet rhythm of someone who had survived her own storms. It made him wonder what she carried behind that tired smile, and why her presence made it suddenly harder to lie to himself. As the minutes passed, something inside him settled just enough to let the truth surface. He knew he couldn't hide forever, not from life, not from himself, and strangely, not from this woman who didn't even know his name. When she finally asked if he was all right, the question landed with more weight than he was prepared for. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat, the truth too heavy to swallow yet too painful to speak. All he managed was a broken, almost whisper that left both of them suspended in a moment that felt like it might change everything. He returned to the diner the next morning, unsure why his feet led him back to the only place where the world hadn't felt like it was closing in on him. The sunlight through the windows made everything look gentler than the night before, but inside he carried the same heaviness that kept his shoulders low and his voice quiet. She noticed him instantly, offering a soft smile that made him feel both exposed and strangely welcomed. As if she could see the pieces of him he tried to gather before stepping inside. He took the same seat at the counter, feeling a fragile sense of safety settle around him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. As she poured him coffee without asking, he wondered how kindness this simple could feel more valuable than the fortunes he once chased. For a moment, he let himself breathe like he belonged somewhere again. He tried to act like his life hadn't fallen apart, but she seemed to sense every word he didn't say. She moved with gentle ease, carrying plates and refilling cups while keeping an eye on him in a way that didn't feel intrusive, just quietly present. He found himself watching her work, noticing how she smiled at strangers, how she never rushed, how she looked like someone who understood struggle without needing to talk about it. The warmth in the room made him feel the weight of loneliness he had carried for years, even before the collapse. It struck him that success had never protected him from emptiness, but this simple connection was already softening something inside him he thought was beyond repair. She finally stopped in front of him, leaning slightly on the counter as if inviting him to breathe a little deeper. He didn't know how to answer when she asked how he was doing, so he gave a small nod that fooled neither of them. Instead of pressing, she told him about the early morning rush, about her son who had fallen asleep at the breakfast table, about the tiny moments that kept her going when life felt heavier than her hands could hold. Something in her voice made him realize how fragile strength could be, and how often it came from places no one expected. He listened, drawn in by a softness his life had never made room for. When her child peeked out from the back room, rubbing sleepy eyes, the world shifted for him in a way he didn't expect. The boy's quiet curiosity reminded him of everything he'd forgotten about innocence and trust. The waitress gently guided her son forward, introducing him with a tone that carried both pride and apology, as though she feared judgment for bringing him to work. But he felt none of that. Instead, he felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of longing and regret for the life he never slowed down long enough to build. The boy's shy smile reached something old and aching inside him. After the boy returned to the back room, the silence between them grew warmer, no longer uncomfortable but quietly revealing. She apologized for the interruption, but he shook his head, grateful for the glimpse into her world. He saw in her eyes a mixture of strength and exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying more than one heart at a time. Without meaning to, he admitted that he envied her ability to hold life together, even when everything seemed stacked against her. She looked at him for a long moment, not with pity, but with a kind of understanding he hadn't earned yet. It made him stay a little longer, hoping she wouldn't ask him to explain the sorrow he still wasn't ready to name. He woke the next day with a heaviness that refused to lift, the kind that settled deep when truth pressed to the surface. Sitting alone in his small temporary room, he felt stripped of everything he once hid behind. Power, certainty, control. The mirror across from him showed a man he barely recognized, worn down by choices he wished he could rewrite. As memories of boardrooms, flashing cameras, and impossible expectations flashed through his mind, shame crawled up his spine like a cold hand he couldn't shake off. He wondered how he had let ambition swallow every part of him until nothing real remained. By the time he returned to the diner, he carried that weight in his posture, hoping she wouldn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But the moment she looked at him, he knew she already sensed the storm he was fighting. When he stepped inside the diner, she was wiping down tables with the same quiet rhythm that made the place feel calmer than anywhere else he knew. She looked up at him with a gentle softness that made his chest tighten, not because she pitied him, but because she didn't. Her calm presence felt like a safe place he wasn't sure he deserved. He sat at the counter, trying to rearrange the broken pieces of himself into something that looked steady, but the silence between them made it impossible to pretend. She asked if he'd slept, and the honesty in her voice disarmed him more than any confrontation could. He answered with a small nod, though they both knew the truth was heavier than a lack of rest. She sensed he was sinking, so she talked, not to pry, but to give him something steady to hold on to. She spoke about her own mornings, the rush to prepare her son for school, the fear of bills stacking too high, and the constant balancing act between working enough to survive and being present enough to raise him. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned strength not from winning, but from refusing to break. As he listened, he realized how small his problems looked beside the quiet courage it took for her to keep moving. He found himself leaning forward, drawn by the honesty in her words, wondering why he had spent so long building walls around a life that had never made him feel this human. He finally lowered his gaze, unable to contain the truth pressing against his breath. He told her he used to run a company, his voice trembling as he admitted it wasn't just any company but one that had defined every part of him. He confessed he had lost everything, his money, his name, the trust of people who once praised him. Saying it aloud felt like stepping off a ledge had been clinging to for too long. She didn't react with shock or judgment. Instead, she listened in stillness, her eyes softening in a way that made him feel seen without being crushed by the weight of his own regrets. For the first time, he felt the sting of relief mixed with shame. She took a slow breath before responding, telling him she understood more than he realized, because losing something essential wasn't new to her. She spoke softly about raising her son alone after someone she trusted walked away, leaving her to rebuild a life from pieces she never expected to hold by herself. Her voice wavered, but didn't break, revealing wounds she no longer hid but still carried. Hearing her pain made him feel something shift inside him, an awareness that he wasn't the only one standing at the edge of what life had taken. Their struggles were different, but the ache was the same. In that moment, he felt a fragile connection form between them, built not on sympathy but on two people, finally speaking truths they never meant to share. The next morning felt different, quieter, as though something unspoken now lived in the space between them. He walked into the diner with a heaviness that didn't crush him the way it once did, softened by the memory of her honesty the day before. She greeted him with a small nod, not overly warm, yet not distant either. Just a simple acknowledgement that felt more real than anything he'd known in years. He sat at the counter, noticing the faint exhaustion beneath her eyes, and wondering how she managed to carry so much on so little rest. He found himself wanting to ease even a fraction of her burden, even though he had nothing left to offer except presence. When she poured his coffee, their hands nearly touched, and the quiet tremor that passed through him made him realize how much he now depended on these small moments to feel whole again. He watched her move between tables, noticing the small winces she tried to hide each time she lifted a heavy tray. Her quiet strength stirred something protective in him, a feeling he hadn't let himself experience in years. When she returned to the counter to catch her breath, he gently asked if she ever took a break. She laughed softly, a tired sound that carried both humor and resignation, telling him breaks were a luxury she rarely earned. He found himself wanting to protest, wanting to fix something in a life that didn't belong to him. But he stayed silent, knowing he had no right to promise help he couldn't yet provide. Still, he felt the pull to stay, to be present, to care in ways he had forgotten how to feel. As the lunch crowd faded, she joined him at the counter for a brief moment, wiping her hands on her apron with a sigh that revealed more exhaustion than she meant to show. He asked about her son, and for the first time, she spoke with a warmth that brightened the dimness beneath her fatigue. She told him about the boy's love for drawing, about the shy grin he gave when he felt proud, and about the fear she carried of failing him despite doing everything she could. Listening to her, he felt a tenderness rise in him, an unfamiliar ache to protect something precious he had no claim to. Her vulnerability made him see just how much she sacrificed each day, and he wondered how anyone could walk away from someone who loved this fiercely. When a sudden rainstorm rolled in, the diner emptied earlier than usual, leaving the two of them in a hush, broken only by the tapping of rain against the windows. She stood near the entrance watching the downpour, and he found himself joining her without thinking. For a moment they stood side by side, their reflections blurred in the glass, both shaped by losses that had carved deep places inside them. She admitted quietly that storms always made her feel small, reminding her of nights she spent wondering if life would ever get easier. He surprised himself by telling her he understood that storms had a way of exposing the things people spent their lives trying to hide. The shared stillness felt heavier than words, yet strangely comforting, like they were learning to breathe in the same rhythm. As the storm quieted, she turned to him with a look that held uncertainty and a fragile thread of trust. She admitted she didn't let people in easily, that life had taught her to rely only on herself. But something about him felt different, in ways she couldn't explain. Her words left him breathless, stirring a mixture of gratitude and fear he didn't know how to voice. He wanted to tell her that she made him feel seen in a world that had once applauded him for all the wrong reasons. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, He offered a small, honest smile, one that carried every truth he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. And as she returned that smile, something unspoken but unmistakably real began to form between them. The calm they had found together didn't last long. By the next morning, whispers were already circling through the city, rumors that the fallen CEO's story had resurfaced with sharper teeth than before. He felt it the moment he stepped outside, the way strangers glanced a second too long, recognizing a face they'd only ever seen in headlines about failure and scandal. His chest tightened as he realized the world wasn't done punishing him. By the time he walked into the diner, he already knew the truth he'd tried to bury was clawing its way back into the spotlight. She noticed his shaken expression before he uttered a word, her eyes narrowing with concern he no longer felt he deserved. He wanted to pretend nothing had changed, but the weight of what was coming pressed against his ribs like a warning he couldn't outrun. She approached him slowly, sensing the turmoil he tried to hide behind a tired half-smile. When she asked what was wrong, his voice failed him for a moment. Then, with a breath that sounded like surrender, he admitted that the story of his collapse had resurfaced, this time with headlines accusing him of things far harsher than the truth had confessed to her. She didn't speak at first, her silence deep and unreadable. He could feel her pulling away even before she moved, the trust I'd built trembling under the weight of what she was hearing. He wanted to explain that he wasn't the villain the world believed, but shame wrapped around his throat like a rope, choking back the words he needed most. When her son wandered out from the back room, rubbing his sleepy eyes, the shift in the air snapped even sharper. The boy smiled at him, recognizing the familiar face that had become a quiet part of his days. But she gently placed a hand on her child's shoulder and guided him back, her expression changing in a way he hadn't seen before. Guarded, uncertain, protective. Something inside him cracked at the sight. He realized then how deeply he wished he had been honest from the beginning. How much easier the truth would have been before the world dragged it into the open. The silence between them thickened as she returned to the counter, her eyes carrying questions he feared he no longer had the right to answer. She finally asked why he hadn't told her everything, her voice soft but trembling with hurt. He tried to explain that shame had kept him silent, that he couldn't bear the thought of being seen through the same lens the world used to tear him apart. But the more he spoke, the more he realized how thin his excuses sounded. She wasn't angry, just disappointed in a way that felt sharper than anger. She told him trust meant more to her than anything, because she had lived too many years carrying the consequences of someone else's broken promises. Her words hit him like a blow, leaving him swallowing a pain he knew he had brought on himself. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back before he could touch her. He understood then that he was losing her. Not because of the scandal, but because he hadn't trusted her with the truth when it mattered. She told him she needed space, her voice gentle but firm, the finality of it settling into the room like a closing door. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his chest. As he stood to leave, he felt the world he had rebuilt in fragile pieces crumble again. But this time, it wasn't money or status slipping through his fingers. It was the first person who had made him believe he could be more than what he'd lost. When he stepped into the fading evening light, he carried a heartbreak deeper than anything he'd faced before, knowing he had no one to blame but himself. Days passed in a blur of silence and regret. With nowhere left to fall, he took whatever work he could find, sweeping floors at a dockside warehouse, unloading delivery trucks, jobs that left his hands blistered and his muscles aching in ways his old life had never prepared him for. Yet the physical strain felt cleaner than the weight he carried in his chest. Each morning he walked past the diner, but didn't step inside, afraid of the pain in her eyes and the confusion in his own. Still, he found himself pausing long enough to see her through the window, moving with the same quiet strength that had once given him breath. He wondered if she knew he was trying to become someone worthy of the trust he had broken, even if she never saw it. He worked until his body felt hollow, the repetitive motions loosening the knots inside him that shame had tightened for months. In those long hours, he realized how much he had taken for granted. Simple kindness, honest work, the feeling of earning something without titles or applause. Each time he lifted a heavy crate, he thought of her carrying her son's world on her shoulders with no praise, no fallback, no safety net. He started staying late to help coworkers without being asked, finding a strange comfort in giving more than he received. At night, the silence of his small rented room felt less suffocating, softened by a growing understanding of the humility he once feared. Even though he stayed away, he couldn't stop thinking about her struggling alone. So he began helping from a distance, quiet, unnoticed. When he learned the diner's old back door had been sticking for weeks, he stayed late one evening to repair it, slipping in after closing hours with borrowed tools. He fixed the loose hinge and oiled the frame, leaving before she arrived the next morning. When he heard from a delivery driver that her son's worn-out backpack had broken, he used the last of his savings to buy a sturdy new one and left it anonymously at the diner's back doorstep. He didn't do these things to redeem himself, but because caring for them felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. She began noticing the changes but didn't know who was behind them. The fixed door, the new backpack, the small repairs she never had time to request. The little miracles that softened the hardest parts of her days. She didn't want to hope, but something inside her whispered that this kind of quiet help came from someone who understood her struggles. Meanwhile, he kept his distance, afraid that approaching her too soon would only reopen wounds. But every time he passed the diner and saw her laugh softly with her son, the ache inside him deepened, reminding him of what it meant to care for someone without expecting anything in return. One late afternoon, she stepped outside to take a breath and found him across the street, exhausted from work, standing with his hands in his pockets, as if unsure whether he was allowed to exist near her anymore. Their eyes met for the first time in weeks, and something in her expression softened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition of the quiet transformation she hadn't seen, but somehow felt. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak, didn't expect anything. He simply gave her a small, hesitant nod, one that carried every apology he wasn't ready to voice. And to his surprise, she didn't look away. She held his gaze for a long, quiet moment before turning back toward the diner, leaving him with a fragile flicker of hope. One he hadn't dared to feel until now. He returned the next morning with no plan except to stop running from the truth he had carried like a shadow. The sun was barely rising, painting the street in soft gold as he approached the diner with a heart that felt heavier than the backpack he'd once bought in secret. He didn't know whether she would speak to him or turn away, but he knew he couldn't hide anymore. When he stepped inside, she looked up from the counter, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something quieter, something unreadable. He stood still, soaked in the weight of his own silence, then told her he needed to speak honestly. Not for forgiveness, but because she deserved nothing less. His voice trembled, but he held her gaze, ready for whatever came next. He told her everything, every detail he had been too afraid to say aloud. How pride had swallowed him, how shame had kept him silent, how losing everything had stripped him down to someone he barely recognized. He told her about the nights he stayed away because he didn't think he deserved her kindness, about the small repairs he made in secret because he wanted to help in the only way he knew how. He admitted he didn't expect her to take him back into her life, but he wanted her to know the truth without the world twisting it first. As he spoke, he felt something inside him unravel, not painfully, but like a knot finally loosening after being pulled too tight for too long. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to feel every breath of uncertainty. Then she told him she had noticed the changes, every small act of kindness that appeared when she needed it most. She admitted she wasn't sure how to trust again, not after everything she'd survived, not after the promises that had once fallen apart in her hands. But she also said she saw something different in him now, something steadier and more real than the version of him the world had turned into a headline. Her voice softened when she said she didn't need perfection, just honesty. And in that moment, he felt hope stir like a quiet spark waiting for air. Her son peeked out from the back room then, clutching the backpack he'd grown attached to, and gave him a small, shy smile. Something inside him nearly broke at the sight, realizing how deeply he wanted to protect both of them. Not out of guilt, but out of love shaped by humility and truth. She watched the moment quietly, and the hesitation in her expression softened as if something fragile in her had finally stopped trembling. She told him she wasn't ready to rush anything, but she was willing to try, to see who they could become without lies or fear clouding the space between them. The weight of her words settled into him like a promise he didn't deserve, but would spend his life honoring. When they stepped outside together at the end of her shift, the sun was setting in colors that felt almost too beautiful for the moment they were living. He walked beside her with a quiet reverence, recognizing that this wasn't a second chance handed to him, but one he had earned through truth, humility, and time. She turned toward him with that soft, searching gaze he would never forget, and said maybe losing everything had led him exactly where he was meant to be. He didn't answer with grand promises or desperate pleas, just a simple truth. He wasn't going anywhere. And as she reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with slow, steady certainty, he realized love didn't cost wealth or status. It cost presence, honesty, and the courage to stay, even when life fell apart. For the first time in years, he felt whole.